There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott Eric Candiati, and joining me tonight for another journey into the mostly unexpected, we welcome back Joe Fortunato. Great to have you back with us, Joe.
Hello, it's great to be back. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. On our latest podcast, we will be delving into two very different Twilight Zone episodes, The Big Tall Wish and A Nice Place to Visit, which are the 27th and 28th episodes from the first season of The Twilight Zone. They originally aired back on April 8th and April 15th of 1960. So, let's take a crack at the speed bag as we work out behind-the-scenes details for The Big Tall Wish. The episode was directed by Ron Winston. If the name sounds familiar, well, we've discussed him before, as he directed The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which we discussed in our podcast episode number 440. It was an exceptional podcast covering two of the better Twilight Zone episodes, that one and Mirror Image. Go back and listen to it if you missed it. He also has one more Twilight Zone episode under his belt, the fifth season's Stopover in a Quiet Town, which has one of the more outlandish twists in the history of the Twilight Zone. But since he's already been covered by this podcast, we can move on to the writing credits, and of course, this episode was written by Rod Serling. Hardly a surprise. As we said before, Serling's own boxing experience led that to be very fertile ground for so many scripts he's written, from Requiem for a Heavyweight through all the Twilight Zone episodes he did as well. Then you mix in the surprisingly subtle, at least by Twilight Zone standards subtle, social commentary on race, a topic Serling was one of the very few, not to shy away from. And it's very clearly a Serling story, even if it doesn't have a hair-raising twist. But more on that later. Let's get to the cast of this fairly unique for its time episode. In this corner, playing the lead role of Bodie Jackson, we have the actor Ivan Nixon. Now, Nixon was born in Harlem. That's in New York City for you out-of-towners, back in 1931. At one point in his childhood, he lived on the same block as acclaimed writer Ralph Ellison and the tap-dancing brothers Gregory and Maurice Hines. He later earned his drama degree at North Carolina Central University, a historically black college. Their theater troupe is actually named the Ivan Dixon Players in his honor. We fast-forward to the late 50s, where Dixon... Is it Dixon or Nixon? Am I saying Dixon? His name is Nixon?
It is Dixon.
Oh, it is Dixon. Okay. I just realized I'm looking through my notes and I've written both Dixon and Nixon at different times. Pretty sure it was Dixon. Thank you. Where Dixon is making his mark on Broadway in groundbreaking dramas such as The Cave Dwellers and Raisin in the Sun. After being a stunt double for Sidney Poitier in The Defiant Ones, he got the role in this Twilight Zone episode, and he would later play a key role in another Twilight Zone episode, I Am the Night, Color Me Black. He did other TV and film work over the next several years, including co-starring with Dorothy Dandridge and with her final screen appearance in an episode of the series Kane's 100, which was released with extra scenes as an actual feature film in Europe and was retitled The Murder Men. And though his theater and film and even TV work often had considerable social significance, the role he's probably most recognized for was that of playing Staff Sergeant James Kinch in the first 5 seasons of Hogan's Heroes. But he eventually grew weary of the part, as he felt it was largely inconsequential and ended up being the only cast member to leave the series before its run had finished. In the 70s and 80s, even though he would take the occasional role, TV and so on, he really worked primarily as a director, mostly for television, ranging from The Bionic Woman to The Rockford Files to Magnum P.I., all the way up to Quantum Leap. He did have a few noteworthy and even controversial feature film directing credits in the early 70s, such as the blaxploitation film Trouble Man, or even more notoriously, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, a movie that was soon pulled from theaters by the FBI out of concern that the film was promoting the idea of an armed revolt. A very full and varied life, Dixon eventually passed away at the age of 76 from kidney failure. Next, we have the then child actor, Stephen Perry, not to be confused with the lead singer of Journey, who portrays little Henry Temple. He got this role after appearing in 3 feature films in a row, and he'd go on to additional TV work. Coincidentally, he actually ends up with a role in the feature film version of A Raisin in the Sun, the production that Nixon had starred in on Broadway. I keep saying Nixon and Dixon. It's going to be the thing the whole.
Well, I think it's. I was going to mention. I'm glad you did that. The two of them starred in that movie. Just released. I'm not sure when they shot these things, but that was released just a year later, and that's a pretty significant, movie in African American Hollywood history. And I'm teaching a Sidney Poitier class right now, so that speaks to me.
Oh, excellent. Honestly, after the 60s, Perry went on to really very small bit parts, often playing cops in Hawaii, which he did 3 times on Magnum PI and The Parent Trap Hawaiian Honeymoon, and a rather forgettable series, One West Waikiki. Also, he apparently was on 5 episodes of Jake and the Fat Man, which was not shot in Hawaii. So let's just move on. Kim Hamilton. She plays Henry's mom, and Miss Hamilton had a fairly long career, 6 decades, in fact, most of which was on television. TV viewers of a certain generation will likely recognize her from any number of parts she played in the 70s and 80s, appearing very prominently in series such as All in the Family, Kojak, Sanford and Son, Good Times. Gosh, Marcus Welby, Quincy, Buck Rogers, The Jeffersons, Simon and Simon, Alice, St. Elsewhere, you get the idea. Her very last role was on the series Private Practice back in 2008, and she passed away 5 years later at the age of 81. I'll mention just 2 other people who appear in the cast. You got Walter Burke, who plays Joe, Jackson's cornerman trainer, right? At least I assume that's what he is. He was a very, very busy character actor with over 170 roles to his credit. He was the sort of actor who always seemed at home on the Western Range or kicking up his heels as a leprechaun or being immersed in crime, corruption, and politics. And let's not sleep on his comedic chops, because this is a guy who appeared alongside everyone from Jack Benny to the Three Stooges to Herman Munster. Which also brings us to fun parts like he was one of the Penguin's main henchmen in a couple Batman episodes, or he was another wacky character on Lost in Space. He's also in both Support Your Local Sheriff and Support Your Local Gunfighter, which are 2 personal favorites of mine. Surprisingly, he was only on 1 Twilight Zone episode, this one. But he did appear years later on that other Serling series, Night Gallery. And finally, we have Henry Scott, who plays Thomas, the somewhat shady promoter that Bodhi is arguing with and busts his knuckles trying to take an ill-advised swing at. Henry appeared on several other TV series during the 1960s, including The Outer Limits. For some reason, he was often relegated to playing cops or feds, except for this role. Somewhat notable as he, was a man of color. And he does appear in 1 more Twilight Zone episode, Season 4's The 30 Fathom Grave. All right, speaking of Twilight Zone episodes, let's get back to this one and get to the story of The Big Tall Wish. We begin in a distinctly urban city setting, and we see a flyer promoting a fight between Bodhi Jackson and Joey Consiglio. And as we see Mr. Jackson in his apartment looking in the mirror, we hear Rod Serling's opening narration. In this corner of the universe, prize fighter named Bodhi Jackson, 183 pounds and an hour and a half away from a comeback at St. Nick's Arena. Mr. Bodhi Jackson, who by the standards of his profession is an aging, over-the-hill relic of what was, and who now sees a reflection of a man who's left too many pieces of his youth in too many stadiums for too many years before too many screaming people. Mr. Bodhi Jackson, who might do well to look for some gentle magic in the hard surface glass that stares back at him. By the way, I just realized not only was I messing up the actor's last name, I was messing up the character's first name because I think I was alternating between Bodhi and Bowley. So,
Well, you mentioned. No, I'll ask it later. I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
it's fine. I love when I realize I'm making an error, but not bad enough that I'm going to edit it later. And as Bowley sees his reflection, he's also being watched by his biggest little fan, Henry, who swears he'll make a big, tall wish for Bowley in the fight tonight. Bowley departs. But as he's being prepped in the locker room, he has an argument with a shady promoter named Thomas, who tries to tempt the nearly washed-up Bowley into easy money, where, you'd get a regular string of fights, just stay on your feet for a couple rounds and you'll get paid. This demeaning behavior, this lack of respect, angers Bowley, who takes a swing at Thomas but hits the wall, busting his knuckles. He goes on with the fight anyway, despite being essentially one-handed. During the fight, Bully is clearly taking a beating and is knocked flat to the canvas. He's about to be counted out by the referee. But as we cross-cut from the fight to Henry watching at home, and then pleading as the boy grabs the TV, reiterating that big, tall wish, suddenly Bully and his opponent switch places, and Bully is the winner of the fight. But Bully is confused. He remembers being knocked down, the ref counting, and nothing else. Even his knuckles no longer ache. His manager, Joey, is stumped as to why Bully would even think he was ever off his feet. Jackson arrives back in the neighborhood as a conquering hero, eventually finding Henry up on the roof. But he's still confused, but now he's become convinced he won the fight, until Henry tells him about the wish. Bully expresses doubt and denial. There's no such thing as magic or miracles, certainly not in wishes. Doesn't believe in them. He's been wishing for things his whole life, and he's never had nothing but a face full of scars to show for it. But Henry insists. No, he begs, he pleads. The Bully has to believe. But Jackson is steadfast in his non-acceptance. And suddenly, we're back at the fight. Bully is back to being flat on his back, except now the count is completed, and he's lost the fight. His hand heavily bandaged, he returns to the neighborhood as people either regard him sadly or don't acknowledge him at all. Back at the apartment building, he asks Henry's mom if he can see Henry, who's already gone to sleep for the night. Now, neither seem to remember the previous winning outcome. All Henry remembers is making the big, tall wish, but since it didn't come true, he pledges to stop making wishes. There ain't no such thing as magic, is there? He asks Bully. Bully resignedly agrees, but then he counters, or maybe there is magic, and maybe wishes too. I guess the trouble is there's just not enough people around to believe. And then Rod Serling wraps it up thusly. Mr. Bully Jackson, 183 pounds, who left a second chance lying in a heap on a rosin-spattered canvas at St. Nick's Arena. Mr. Bully Jackson, who shares the most common ailment of all men, the strange and perverse disinclination to believe in a miracle, the kind of miracle to come from the mind of a little boy, perhaps only to be found in the Twilight Zone. Now, before we get to opinions and other such insights and things, I should point out the historical significance of this episode. Listeners, you might have noticed that all the main roles in this production were filled by Black actors. In fact, the only Caucasian actors outside of a few extras in the crowd would be Joey the manager and Bodie's opponent. Now remember, this is 1960. We're a few years before the Civil Rights Bill. Jim Crow laws are still in effect in various parts of the country. I noticed that the entry that's on Wikipedia and the entry that's on the Twilight Zone fandom wiki, they're pretty much identical, so I'm going to crib directly from them to cover this a little bit more. The all-black principal cast was groundbreaking for television in 1960. Said Rod Serling at the time, and we're quoting from the Twilight Zone Companion by Mark Scott Zicree, television, like its big sister, the motion picture, has been guilty of the sin of omission. Hungry for talent, desperate for the so-called new face, constantly searching for a transfusion of new blood, it has overlooked a source of wondrous talent that resides under its nose. This is the Negro actor. Now, a few other Twilight Zones followed the example of this episode and cast Black actors in significant roles, including the pastor in I Am the Night, Color Me Black, which was also played by Ivan Dixon. Then we have a child in the mall in The Night of the Meek and the electrician in the brain center at Whipple's. The thing to note is these inclusions, though seemingly insignificant by modern standards, were so revolutionary at the time that the Twilight Zone was awarded the Unity Award for Outstanding Contributions to Better Race Relations in 1961. So that was before we got into this episode and we were actually choosing who was going to talk about them, Joe, I had said this was kind of an important episode, at least historically speaking, if not as far as being an iconic Twilight Zone episode, but just becomes an important one, and it's for this very reason.
Yeah, and we're not going into opinions yet, I guess, but one thing that I was struck when I rewatched this is I was aware of sort of the cultural heft of the episode, and I remembered it, somewhat. But I didn't really like the episode as much as its reputation is embedded in my mind, if that makes any sense. And I think I was mildly disappointed that a culturally significant episode like this, I thought was a bit flawed, or at least slow, in my opinion.
Right. Well, that's a fair opinion, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it, but I'll get there. I don't want to open with opinion before I get to a few other things, but I'm probably not much different than you in this category. For me, this was an episode I had a very faint memory of, and the memory I had of it was probably due to the actual fight sequence where they did this series of still shots. The camera angle from under Ivan Nixon, like as if it was being shot through a glass floor, and that sudden jarring switch between Victor and KO'd opponent, whatever. That was what kind of stuck in my head because that visually and the editing was different than anything I'd seen in TV of that era. It just kind of stood out. As far as the overall episode, I mean, the way to sum it up before I get to really opining on it, I look at it as this episode, it's simple, it's sad, it's poignant, conveys a message that when one lacks faith, you will ultimately be flattened by the granite-like fist of reality. In a weird way, I think it's almost the opposite of what you'd normally see as like a traditional Christmas message, which, we'll actually see explored in a later season with Night of the Meek. But this is an episode that's not about dreams coming true, which kind of makes it unusual, if not altogether tragic. I hesitate to say ultimately tragic because at the end, Boley and Henry are still content and they're looking forward to a day of hot dogs and hockey. So you got that going for them. But now folding back to your opinion, I think if one is going to be disappointed by the episode, there is that even if most people going into it aren't aware of the history of the episode, they haven't read something about it and know that going into it, you pick up on it fairly soon. Within the first 5 minutes, you're probably, especially if you've watched old TV, from the 50s and 60s, especially early 60s, you're already thinking, this is unusual. I'm seeing a lot of black faces and as opposed to people in blackface for that matter. I think maybe with that, you'd expect there to be something with a bit more heft to it. A bit that just hits, no pun intended since we are dealing with a boxer, but something that just hits a little bit harder. As a result, it seems it's very slight. Like it's like, oh, okay. Remember I said something about the 1980s version of the Twilight Zone that came back on CBS back in like the mid to late 80s? And if I'm not mistaken, there were a few times that it would play for an hour and they'd have three episodes. They'd have one that was oddly like a super short one, where you might have two that are like 20 something minutes in length or whatever, but you might have one that might be like just slightly longer than a Looney Tunes cartoon or something like that. I distinctly remember that. I'll insist that happened. If I'm wrong, then I've had a really bizarre dream life. This feels like this could have been a 10-minute episode, and it still would have been like, okay, that was nice, but it didn't really. I felt there needed to be some more. Maybe the stakes weren't big enough, and there wasn't enough of a cliff to fall off of here. It was just okay. But at the end, everything's fine, and you're content without believing in miracles and magic and is that really the best message to tell by the end of the story as well, I guess?
To me, it wasn't even so much the actual story part, although I do agree with everything you just said. It was kind of, frankly, the production values just this felt like a little bit of we're running out of money on this episode. From the direction and especially since the same director did Maple Street, which is fantastically directed. The whole boxing match was very close up, and it's like, don't show us any extras, don't show us any of the crowd scenes. It felt lacking, and even some of the makeup was not that great. And the young man's acting is a little iffy in places, but so it just, like I said, my memory was that this was an important episode. Maybe that's the word I want to use. And I didn't feel that way watching it in my current incarnation. I will mention, you mentioned Zikri's book. I never know if I'm saying that right. Mark Scott Zikri or Zikri. But anyway, I didn't reread it before this podcast. Maybe I should have, but I do remember all those years ago reading that and reading about this episode, which is why somewhere in my mind it had a little bit more cultural heft to it.
Right. Well, like I said, I probably didn't really give it much thought until I was preparing for this podcast, and then I was looking into it, and I realized, oh, I forgot how important this episode was, because I think I only knew it was important just by having watched and going, well, that's kind of different. Because
No, I knew it by the title when we were going to do this one. Go, okay, that's an important episode,
right.
and so that was in my brain somewhere.
Well, the way I look at it, that I mean, sometimes historically significant things, that are important may not necessarily be great as far as either be the story or the act, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of things throughout the history of both film and television that would fall into that category, you know. So, and my only counter, if it was a counter at all, I don't think it's a counter. I'm not going to say it's a bad episode.
Nor would I. I don't want to give that impression either.
It was just like, huh, okay. See, the weird thing for me. Oh, by the way, you made a reference to obviously the child acting, and I was kind of the kid. At times, I think he's good, and at times, I think he's not. It's really hard to judge someone who is still in single digit years as a child actor, especially then. So like I was like, oh, if this, and actually what I thought of his performance at times, like, if this was a stage performance, it works better, but on television, it's not working because we're right there with him.
Agree.
Where the way he kind of projects when he says certain things, well, that works if you're trying to hit the back row in a theater. On TV, it becomes a little, which is funny since there were so many live plays done on television, and that was one of the things actors had to learn how to kind of like, oh, you better pull it back a little bit because otherwise you're going to look like you're a big ham.
Well, it's sort of like when we look at like Billy Mumy, doing his noteworthy work on Twilight Zone. I don't think, oh, this is bad acting because it's perfect for the role. But I felt like this young actor was channeling on, I'm going to make the big tall wish,
Yeah.
big tall,
Well, it's interesting because I mean, I can't remember. I guess we've seen a few. I can't really think of them right now. But oh yeah, when the guy goes back to a small town, whatever. Throughout the Twilight Zone, we're going to see a number of child actors, and some of them are actually quite good. And I actually do like Billy Murphy. I mean, that's such a great episode. How can I not? But we'll see as we go. At the end of the day, if I was going to say something even more positive about the episode overall, I did feel, especially in lieu of a lot of the episodes I've watched as of late, I felt, you know what? But it's a nice change of pace for the Twilight Zone, which is one of the great things about the show overall, is that it's almost like, a Cracker Jacks. Like, you never know what you're going to get from episode to episode if you've never seen the show before, and you can be freaked out one week and pleasantly surprised, and maybe some weeks you might be bored. You never know. Okay, so
another thing,
sure.
Another trope, sort of, that occurred to me as I'm watching this. I know that boxing used to be a much bigger sport in the American culture, back in the 40s and even prior to that. But there's always this trope of the young kid hero worshiping the champ or the boxer or whatever, and we've literally had movies called The Champ and things like that, and I just sort of felt that was a bit derivative or well-trod ground. And you had already mentioned, Serling himself doing more than a few boxing stories in his time. It's just the hero worship of this kid and a boxer. And I'm like, boy, we've seen that before.
No, you're absolutely right. That is one of the more common themes. I mean, a lot of times, it's a kid and the athlete, and I think it's a boxer more often than any other.
That's what I'm saying. More than any other sport, it's always a boxer.
But what Serling's counter would be to that is like, right, but this time they're both African American or both black or whatever word they would have used in 1960, and that would have been something you hadn't seen before at that time. We're looking at it through 60 years in the past glasses, where it's like, it doesn't seem that unique to me, But you're absolutely right, absolutely. And speaking of tropes, And feel free to, and you can jump in during this. I don't mind at all. So the ones we got going out through this episode, as far as things we see in Twilight Zone episodes, well, boxing and corruption and magic and wishes and such. We open on Bodhi looking in the mirror, and I actually forgot that I need to be keeping an eye out for extreme use of mirrors in the Twilight Zone. I think I might have missed several episodes. I'm going to go back and check. I will not waste time on a future podcast detailing the ones I missed. I just want to keep track of that for some strange reason. What else? What else? Okay, we had the idea of magic and wishes, the innocence of a child. I think that's enough. Rating the ending. Look, it's a fine but ultimately unclimactic ending. I'll give the ending a 6. Rating the episode overall, I think I'm close to where you are. I might be slightly, well, in a rarity, I might be slightly nicer. Um, I'll go up one tick from there and go to a 6.5. I feel that's pretty much, it's like, it was fine. I've seen it. Now I remember it. And now I can move on. That's kind of how I felt.
One thing I wanted to ask your opinion on
Sure.
the name Boley Jackson. That's a very unique name. Is Boley short for something that we can think of, or is it a nickname, or are we? I mean, we don't know obviously in the episode. I'm always sort of fascinated sometimes when writers come up with names for characters that I've never heard anywhere else. That sounds like a boxer to me, actually, Boley Jackson. So kudos to Mr. Serling. But I was the name was unusual enough that I took note.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the name to know enough of whether it's a nickname or it's a shorter version of something else, because I'd start trying to figure, well, what name could it be? Beauregard? No, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know.
Quite possible.
That maybe that's why I wrote Bodhi so many times instead of Bowley, because I was probably thinking of the character from The Wire or something like
Well,
that.
someone had to, concoct that name or make it up, or knew someone named Boley, and it just, I wish we had access to that story.
Well, try tapping the mind of one of my favorite creators, the guy who does the television series like Fargo and everything. He tends to come up with the most crazy names for all his characters. You know, puts David Lynch to shame. Okay, so I'm gonna actually skip the preamble I sometimes do to set the scene for the next episode, because I looked it over and I felt this feels too much like a summation of the actual episode, which is really going to be your department. So instead, I'm just going to get to the creative credits behind our next episode, which is A Nice Place to Visit. First, the episode was directed by John Brown, a name that by now should be familiar to podcast listeners. He was the person who directed the most Twilight Zone episodes, an even dozen, and we've already covered 4 of them on previous pods, such as Time Enough at Last and Mirror Image. In fact, he directed episodes in all 5 seasons of the Twilight Zone, so we'll be hearing his name fairly consistently for the next few years on this podcast. The episode was written by Charles Beaumont, who, after Serling himself, was the most prolific Twilight Zone writer. We discussed his fascinating but incredibly tragic and short-lived life back on STVD 433 when we covered the episode Perchance to Dream. Go back there to listen to how sad his life was. So let's just move to the cast. And while there are a number of glorified extras and bit players in this episode, it really comes down to 2 actors. Yay! First, we have in the role of Mr. Henry Francis Rocky Valentine. Hey, Rocky Valentine, talk about a name that could have been for a boxer. We have the actor Larry Bleeden, a Jewish kid from Houston, Texas, whose actual neighbor growing up was famed actor Rip Torn. Like so many others of his greatest generation, Bleeden served in World War II. He was a Marine. And like many others already discussed on this podcast, ended up doing radio work and theater here and there until moving to New York City to really try to make a go at acting. He appeared on Broadway a number of times throughout his life, from Mr. Roberts early in his life to a Tony Award-winning performance in A Funny Thing Happened to on the Way to the Forum nearly 25 years later. He really didn't do much film work. He appeared in a few films, such as Kissed Him For Me, a film with Cary Grant and Jane Mansfield, so probably nobody ever noticed he was even on screen with those 2 there, and on A Clear Day You Can See Forever with Barbra Streisand. Really did a lot of TV work, mainly anthology series ranging from Playhouse 90 to shows, like The Twilight Zone. But honestly, he probably made a far bigger impression TV-wise on game shows. He became a frequent panelist on shows like Password and To Tell the Truth. I'm sure I'm sure he already knows. And I also am sure that my co-host was excited to learn that he was even on Match Game during the 1974 season. He actually even briefly hosted a revival of What's My Line for a couple years in the 70s. But sadly, because we have to have at least one or two of these on a Twilight Zone podcast, the end came far too soon for Mr. Bleedin. Set to be the host for an upcoming new game show called Show Offs, he took an early vacation in Marrakesh, Morocco, where he had a horrific car accident, going off the road and eventually succumbing to multiple injuries, internal injuries, I should say. He died just 17 days short of his 50th birthday. He should note, I chose not to make a dark pun about his last name there. Bleeding. Anyway, I move on to the next actor of major note in this episode, and that, of course, would be Mr. Sebastian Cabot as Mr. Pip. Not to be confused with the title character of a Twilight Zone episode we are not going to get to till season 5, also named Pip. Now, Sebastian Cabot, or should we say Charles Sebastian Thomas Cabot, was born in Marylebone, London back in 1918. After working as a chauffeur and valet for a British actor at the time, Frank Pettingell, I believe his name was, he decided to pursue acting himself. Wasn't an easy road. However, it did lead to things like his first film role in Alfred Hitchcock's Secret Agent, and I've actually seen that. And then once again, there was this thing called World War II, and he served with the British Army during those tumultuous years. Afterwards, his career grew more and more varied after the war. Theater, film, television, comedies, dramas, Shakespeare, and Disney. Later, he'd be well known as the narrator for several Winnie the Pooh films for Disney. He's probably best known, I would say, for his role as Mr. French on the long-running 60s series Family Affair. I'm actually going to sidestep a lot of his other appearances on film and television. If Joe knows of any others that he feels are worth mentioning, I'll leave that to him. I want to go somewhere else if I'm going to get a chance to talk about Sebastian Cabot, because people with a sense of humor might also know him for his 2 appearances on the Golden Throats collections from Rhino Records, which are among the only CDs I personally still possess, even though I have nothing to play them on, because he recorded spoken word renditions of a couple Bob Dylan songs on those, It Ain't Me, Babe, and Like a Rolling Stone. And it turns out, if you dig hard enough, you very well may unearth an entire album Cabot recorded of 12 such songs, which featured other hits like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin'. I kind of want to get a hold of this album if at all possible. I'm going to track this down, even, once again, if I have nowhere to play it.
I had completely forgotten about that, the Golden Throats collection and his renditions, and I am smiling ear to ear now because
It ain't me, babe.
that is
Oh, no,
crazy.
no, no. It ain't me, babe. It ain't the one you're looking for. It's so funny. However, this is going to sound eerily familiar. Cabot also left us far too soon, but he died of a stroke at the age of 59, and that was way back in 1977. Oh, by the way, Bleedin also passed away in the 70s, 1975. Well, that's a little weird, but, Twilight Zone. Anyway, that is enough from me. Because
It's
now
funny because that he said, he that age. I mean, I wouldn't have. If you had told me he was 50 during this Twilight Zone episode, I would have said, okay.
yeah.
I mean, it's not that he looked old forever. He just looked kind of the same forever in my memory. But I thought he was perfectly cast in this, and we'll talk about that afterwards.
Right. Well, I'm actually going to let you take the wheel so you can, as I love using the word delve, you can delve more into the actual episode of A Nice Place to Visit. So take it away, Joe.
All right, well, let's talk about the narration. First, I should say the title comes from A Nice Place to Visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. That old phrase that probably many people know. The opening narration says, Mr. Serling, portrait of a man at work. The only work he's ever done. The only work he knows. His name is Henry Francis Valentine, but he calls himself Rocky because that's the way his life has been. Rocky and perilous and uphill at a dead-end run all the way. He's tired now, tired of running or wanting, of waiting for the breaks that come to others, but never to him, never to Rocky Valentine. I probably should have mentioned that while that narration's happening, he's committing theft. He's a crook. Uh, Rocky is then shot by the cops in escaping this robbery, and the narration continues. A scared, angry little man, he thinks it's all over now, but he's wrong. For Rocky Valentine, it's just the beginning, which leads us into the actual story. Small time crook Henry Rocky Valentine is gunned down by police during a botched robbery and awakens to find himself in a strange but luxurious afterlife. Greeted by a white suited man named Pip, who claims to be his guide, Rocky discovers that everything he desires, women, money, fine clothes, winning every bet at the casino, is instantly his for the taking. At first, he believes he's in heaven, thrilled that he's finally living this life that he'd always dreamed of and didn't have any of the consequences or limits. However, as time passes, Rocky grows bored and frustrated by the predictability of his perfect new world. Nothing challenges him, nothing excites him, and the thrill of winning is faded because he can never lose. In desperation, he tells Pip he's not cut out for heaven and asks to go to the, quote, other place. Instead, Pip delivers the twist, and it's a good one. This is the other place, he says, which leads us to the closing narration. A scared, angry little man who never got a break. Now he has everything he ever wanted, and he's going to have to live with it for eternity in the Twilight Zone. And of course, the episode serves as an ironic lesson about desire, fulfillment, and the idea that eternal pleasure without struggle or meaning can be its own form of torment. And that's what Rocky Valentine experiences. And it's a good one line. It may not be, it's a cookbook, but it's still a pretty good, gut punch line, even if you kind of see it coming.
Oh, absolutely. The way I look at this episode before we get, and there's lots of, I think we're both, I suspect we're both going to be armed with little fun details and facts about it, whatever. But before we even get into those, I look at this as, while it's not Mount Rushmore level Twilight Zone, it's kind of that mid-tier kind of, if nothing else, there's something iconic about it. The ending is iconic. There's the, it's something that's had been done to a certain extent before. It's certainly been done since. I mean, anyone who is a fan of the series, The Good Place, that's one of the massive reveals, spoiler, in The Good Place, because they think it's heaven the whole time. And it takes several episodes before you're like, wait, this isn't heaven. This isn't The Good Place. This is the other place. Mm-hmm. So I have an affection for an episode that, even though I see it coming the whole time, I'm enjoying the ride of how we're going to get there. And there's so many interesting choices and little details throughout, both by the writers and the production staff, and even the actor himself and the lead role that I just think make it just a little bit different and actually added to my enjoyment of the episode overall.
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of indicated that the previous episode, I was a little bit disappointed, thinking my memory of it was greater than it actually was watching it. This was actually the opposite. I remembered the episode, but I said I really enjoyed that more than I thought I was going to. I think it's a nice little episode.
Oh, absolutely. I love learning of a lot of the little behind the scenes stuff with this one. The fact that the fact that Beaumont's idea was originally, they were first trying to get Mickey Rooney to play the part. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Mickey Rooney would have been excellent in that part. And it's funny because the episode that Mickey Rooney does eventually appear on, you can kind of see it, whatever. And actually, that's actually a pretty good. It's actually one of Mickey Rooney's best on-screen performances. You'll see in a Twilight Zone episode.
See, I disagree though. I mean, Mickey Rooney was great. He probably would have been great, and I'm probably wrong. I just don't think he was hard-boiled enough for the character. I don't know that I don't know that he was right.
Well, what's interesting is that this actor outside of this role was pretty much known for light, fluffy comedy stuff.
Which is when you told me he was a game show host, yeah. I'm like, that doesn't track.
Which is why, because him playing an edgy guy, this was a fairly much a rarity for him. And if you do see, well, you probably remember, but you probably haven't seen it in many years. When we get to the Mickey Rooney episode, The Last Night of a Jockey, that's Rooney with as much of an edge as he's ever had in any role ever. And it's pretty much the total opposite of, say, the character he played in, I don't know, Breakfast at Tiffany's. But what was more interesting in the memo that Beaumont had proposed, to Serling, he proposed that if they couldn't get Rooney, that Serling himself should play the part. And I kept thinking, there's no way Serling would do that. And of
I
course,
could see him playing Pip, maybe. Although him playing any role in any episode is a completely terrible idea.
no, it takes, there's only one episode we're going to get to that has Serling doing a little bit extra work, which is actually my favorite moment in any Twilight Zone ever. But beyond that, no, Mr. Serling's the narrator, and that's that. But I did think that was a fun little. I kept wondering, was Beaumont being serious? Because there's no way Serling would have done that.
No, I already kind of said that I think Sebastian Cabot was really good in this role. And of course, my Gen X version of him is Mr. French. And so I'm used to seeing him playing a servant, a butler, something of that, that character. And I thought that he was pretty good in a fairly limited role. Limited by range. I mean, he's
Right.
in pretty much every scene.
I mean, what's funny, there's certain similarities with this episode and, say, Escape Clause. Because they both deal with someone who appears, except in Escape Clause, it's pretty clear who you're dealing with right from the get-go, that you're dealing with someone from the demonic depths, not an angel. And here it's sidestepped. Although there was one line earlier that I kept thinking, I wish they could have changed that line because he could have reacted to it. Because he does say something like either, I don't know if he says heaven, but he might make an angel reference earlier on, and it's not acknowledged. And I kept thinking, oh, they probably shouldn't have had him say that there. But I think as I was reading somewhere, they both have a main character, and their lack of imagination and demand for instant gratification, I'm directly quoting, cause them to be trapped in the supernatural rut, which would be easily escapable for someone who just simply had more wit. But speaking of other episodes, one of the things I forgot about in this episode, because I remember the story and I remember the stuff with the girls. I remember it being like, "Ooh, that's a little strong there," but okay. Um, the Hall of Records. I thought that looked great. There was something just very stark and kind of creepy about it. I thought the production design was very nice on it. Then it turns out those stairs are the same stairs that were used in Time Enough at Last. So that's a Twilight Zone for you, recycling things from either, adjacent movie sets or their own set, whatever. But the fact that this concept of, the Hall of Records, which has the files for, all the people in hell and where it's located, I really thought that was fascinating. I know they didn't spend much time in the episode there, but that was one of the things that kind of made me go, ooh. And I love to see it from just going through the file, and you start realizing what a horrible person he was, even as a child. Like he kills a dog when he was 6 or something. Well, it bit me.
Well, I agree. I mean, the production values are pretty good in this one, and maybe that's because they did reuse sets and whatnot, and also props. I don't know. You were probably going to mention, but help me out. Why am I blanking on the machine?
The slot machine from the
slot
Fever.
machine, yes, yeah. Was from the Fever episode. But I mean, his heavenly or his fantasy suite, if you want to call it that, was really well done, really, lush and amazing. And, yeah, so I just thought the production value was much better than what we had kind of just seen in the previous episode.
Well, it's interesting. It's also because this dealt with, they had to have a lot of different sets. So it's one of those things where that also, is what, so some episodes might bite more of your budget, than others. And this one, because you've got to have the casino room, then you got to have where he's doing the robbery, then you have to create the whole alleyway, and then you got the lavish room, then you've got the exterior from the casino. Oh, look, we need a car for this episode. Now you've got the Hall of Records. That's already like 8. That's like, I think, 8 different sets at least. That, and for since there are Twilight episodes which are all just on one set. There's an episode which the entire episode is in a pool hall for, and we'll see how, the bottle, it's kind of like, the bottle episode. Twilight Zone did bottle episodes all the time.
Yeah.
Some of the most famous episodes of all time are bottle episodes. Might be in an old lady's basement apartment, or an old lady's cabin. But there's a lot I really enjoy about this, but one thing I like, the little subtle touches. there's a moment when Valentine, he does kind of, it's not exactly a double take, but it's almost like that when he's about to leave with Pip. I think it's before he's about to go to the Hall of Records, maybe. Um, and he's leaving the three girls in the bedroom. And then there's this, he just kind of looks back and has a reaction. And I kept thinking, ooh, I wonder what the three girls are doing because there's certainly an implication from his look there. It's just a little touch. I don't even know if it was in the script or not, but I thought it was a great touch. And then you have something which I thought was just so silly, and I don't know if anyone would have cared or noticed it. And again, it involves that apartment. I think it involves those girls, in fact, when he's ushering people out, and one of them has a glass, like a drink or something. And he does take care to take the glass back and put it down somewhere in the apartment as he's ushering everybody out. And I kept going like, why would he care about a random glass from his apartment, which they probably all just magically replace themselves anyway, and probably don't even need to be washed, quite frankly. But he does go, and I can't imagine that was in the script. I think he just decided to do that. I think like it reminded me of like, Bugs Bunny asking for a nickel to make a call inside the house when it's just a regular just a regular phone. I just love when I see little things like that. I really get a kick out of them.
Well, you kind of hinted a little bit about some of the brazenness of the girls. Hey, what are they doing? This was singled out this episode, as you probably know, for the time at least. Its sexual innuendo was really pretty much out there, and in fact, CBS program practice has requested that Valentine not refer to the girl as a broad that's really stacked, even though the crudity and that kind of language was really essential to the unsavory qualities of the Valentine character.
Right, right, absolutely. Also, if you're not familiar with Sebastian Cabot, you might not you might be surprised to learn that they actually made him basically bleach and peroxide his hair and beard. I wondered about that because I was like, did you have to do that? But then I guess it's just they just wanted that certain look. He's wearing an all white suit, so he
Match the
wants his
white
everything,
suit, yeah.
So even though there's a certain Colonel Sanders that's kind of quality to doing that, but but then I thought about it some more. It's like, wait, if it's you have the all white suit and the white beard and whatever, it gives him a more quote unquote heavenly like appearance. So then the twist, as opposed to the character we saw in, say, the Escape Clause episode, who was did not have white hair and was a rather dark character from the get go with
Yeah.
his flaming stamp and such. Um, Also, I mean, I remember I wrote this down in my notes, and I was going to mention it when I do the grades and stuff, but I'm going to mention it now instead because there was one thing I thought was it works in the episode just because it's how the episode is ending, so it's fine. Because it works with this as Pip is laughing demonically and so on. But part of me was like, why is he locked in his apartment? What
I
difference does
thought the
that
same
make?
thing,
There's nowhere
actually.
for him because this entire domain is his hell. So who cares if he runs out? It's not like there's anywhere he can go. He's not
And he was
about to be.
already outside. They went in his car and stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And so that didn't make sense other than just to like hammer the point on how he's trapped, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah.
But I just don't. That's
I thought the exact same thing.
okay. I'm glad we both were on the same page for that one. I think that's all I can think of that I would mention about it. I mean,
It was mentioned in a Sopranos episode, oddly enough, and chasing it. The episode was. I don't remember the actual reference in the Soprano, but when I was researching the episode, that was one of the pop culture references that listed.
oh yeah, that's right. I did see it was listed in a Sopranos episode. Also, it was funny because there's a moment where the thing with the money, when he wants it to be in 5G notes, and I realized that wait, that was a thing once upon a time. Once upon a time, there were actually $5,000 bills, and they stopped making those a long time ago. And it turns out it stopped printing them back in 1945, but they were actually still in circulation in 1960. So $1 million in 5G notes would have been 200 individual bills. Because when he opens up the drawer for $1 million,
Mhm.
it doesn't. At first, I was like, it doesn't really look like it's that much money. But then I realized, oh wait, each of those bills represents $5,000. Oh, okay. That might just be a couple hundred. Okay, that works for me now. You didn't screw up, Mr. Sherrill. You didn't screw up, or Beaumont, or whoever. Anyway, I can get to the tropes now. If there's anything else, we can filter it in while I'm talking about it. Well, they're all over this episode. You've got your crook, you've got your gunplay, you've got death, you've got a demon or devil, not to mistake the fact that he's mistaken for an angel. We've got mirrors, we've got showgirls, we've got gambling, and we've even got a sweet convertible and a sweet twist that gives a person their just desserts. That's how I would cover the tropes for this one. Now, to rate the ending. Look, the ending is obvious as all get out, but I still consider it to be in that mid-tier classic endings, like I said earlier. I'll give the ending a 7.5. The episode, however, that is tough. On one hand, before rewatching it, I never really thought that highly of this one. I always thought it was patently obvious what was happening from the get-go. But watching it again, as we were saying earlier, it is damn entertaining. Even though, here's where I put the note. Even though I don't understand why that door doesn't open. There we go. But I will give the overall episode I'll give it a 7. Thinking 7.5. Nah, you know what? I changed it. 7.5. I'll make it the same as the ending. I want to make it more of a clear difference between that one and the previous episode. So I'll give it a 7.5.
Yeah. I don't do ratings like you do, but I concur with that one. I think that's, if you would have gone 7, I'd go, I got to kick it up a little bit.
Yeah, I realize I did have. It's funny because when you think when I just write a number, just the actual digits, those are the ones I'm usually not as sure of. But when I write the word, it means that should be that. Oh, that's definitely what it is. And here it's reversed. Like I was sure about the ending, I wasn't sure about the episode. All right, never mind. Let's walk up the stairs from this brightly lit dark place to a world perhaps a little less bright, but hopefully a little less dark. We can nod our heads to 2 more Twilight Zone episodes that we've covered. And I can thank you, Joe, for your fine service once again in our discussion. Thanks for everything, Joe.
Well, thanks for having me as always. And everyone can go check out my website, joefortunato.net, and see what I'm up to in my world. But I always look forward to joining you here on the Twilight Zone podcast.
Excellent. And as for you, the listeners, while I do apologize, we haven't followed the schedule as rigidly as I would have liked. Sometimes the real world can impinge on the one of fantasy. I will say the podcast will be back in a few weeks to talk about the next 2 Twilight Zone episodes. First, we'll have the unsettling story of Nightmare as a child, and an episode frequently cited as one of the most iconic or perhaps just beloved episodes of the series, A Stop at Willoughby. They are the 29th and 30th episodes from season 1. I would certainly recommend watching them both via Amazon Prime, Paramount Plus, or watch it with commercials on one of the free streaming services, just like we did back in the day. And after such viewing, I do hope you will all join us afterwards. Thank you, and good night.